The tiny German Shepherd puppy lay frozen on the cabin steps, its small body stiff with ice, shallow breaths barely visible as a Navy SEAL knelt in the snow, tears in his eyes, realizing if he turned away now, this fragile life would end before the sun rose. If this moment touches your heart, type Amen, and stay with us to see how one act of kindness changes everything. Winter had settled deep into the mountains of northern Idaho, not with drama, but with a quiet persistence that seeped into wood and bone alike, turning days pale and still and nights long enough for old memories to stretch their limbs. Snow lay thick across the pines and the narrow dirt road that led to Ethan Walker's cabin, muting the world until even the wind seemed to move with caution. Ethan had lived alone in that cabin for nearly 4 years, long enough for the silence to stop feeling temporary and start feeling permanent, long enough for the routines of solitude to become a kind of armor he wore without thinking. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the angular build of a man shaped by discipline rather than comfort. His dark hair cut short out of habit, his face weathered and sharp, jaw set in a way that suggested a man who had learned to keep his emotions contained, because letting them loose once had cost him everything. A former Navy SEAL, Ethan had left the service after a mission that ended in injury and a life that ended in loss, a car accident years earlier that took his wife and unborn child on an icy road, not unlike the one that now lay frozen outside his door. Since then, he had chosen places where no one asked questions and expectations did not follow you home, and this cabin, tucked into the trees far from town, suited him just fine. That morning, he rose before the sun, as he always did, not because he needed to, but because sleep rarely came easily anymore, pulling on worn flannel and boots as the cold crept in through the floorboards, his breath visible in the dim interior light. He moved through his routine with mechanical precision, stoking the fire, pouring coffee, avoiding the quiet corners of his thoughts, until the soft scrape of something against wood reached him from the other side of the door, so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in first, sharp and biting, followed by a sight that brought him to an abrupt halt. On the top step of the porch lay a German Shepherd puppy, impossibly small, no more than 2 weeks old, its tiny body curled inward as if trying to disappear, fur stiff and matted with ice, delicate ears flattened against its head, and long thin icicles hanging from its chin and chest. Frost clung to its paws and belly, sealing it to the wood, and its breathing was so shallow Ethan had to lean closer to be sure it was still alive at all. For a moment he simply stood there, the training that had once taught him how to move under fire now failing him entirely. Because this was not a battlefield and there was no enemy to confront, only a life so fragile it seemed wrong that it existed at all in a world this cold. He had seen death up close more times than he could count, had learned to accept it as a fact rather than a failure, but something about the size of that puppy, about the way it had dragged itself to his door and collapsed, cracked through the distance he had spent years building around himself. His mind offered excuses automatically, the same ones he had perfected over time. Nature was cruel. This was not his responsibility. Getting involved always led to loss. But his body ignored them, and before the thoughts had finished forming, he was already kneeling in the snow, his bare hands hovering uncertainly before touching the frozen fur. The puppy whimpered once, barely a sound at all, and that was enough to undo him. Ethan scooped the small body up against his chest, startled by how little it weighed, by the stiffness of the ice coating it, by the way its heart fluttered weakly beneath his palm, and carried it inside, slamming the door shut against the cold with his foot. Inside the cabin, the fire cast a dim orange glow across the walls, and he laid the puppy down on a folded towel near the hearth, working slowly, carefully, breaking the ice away with trembling fingers, afraid that one wrong move would do more harm than the cold already had. As the ice began to melt, the puppy stirred again, its eyes fluttering open for a brief, unfocused moment, dark and glassy, and Ethan felt something twist painfully in his chest at the sight. He had not planned for this, had not wanted anything that needed him, because needing meant staying, and staying meant risking the kind of pain that had nearly broken him once before. He wrapped the puppy in another towel, pressing his hands gently around its tiny body, breathing warmth into it as if that alone might be enough to keep it here. As he worked, a memory surfaced uninvited, of holding something small and warm once, of promises made in a hospital room that never came to pass, and he forced the thought aside with a sharp shake of his head. From the window, he could just see the faint outline of the neighboring property miles away, where Margaret Hill lived alone, a woman in her early 70s with silver hair usually tucked into a neat braid, her frame thin but upright with a stubbornness that had carried her through decades of loss, including a son killed overseas, a grief that had closed her off from the world and taught her to trust no one but herself. Ethan had spoken to her only a handful of times, brief exchanges of necessity rather than friendship, two people who understood silence better than words. He doubted she would even know what to do with something like this. The puppy let out another weak sound, and Ethan leaned closer, his voice rough when he finally spoke, low and steady in the way he used to calm men bleeding out on foreign ground. "I won't leave you," he said quietly, the words surprising him as much as the promise behind them. "Not today." As he sat there on the floor beside the fire, watching the puppy's chest rise and fall, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, the realization settling in that this was not just about saving a life from the cold, but about the choice he was making in that moment, to stay present, to care, to open a door he had kept locked for years. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless, but inside the cabin, with the warmth slowly returning to the tiny body in his hands, Ethan Walker understood that whatever came next, he had already crossed a line he could not step back over, and for the first time in a very long while, the thought did not terrify him as much as it should have. The day remained locked in winter's grip, the light outside pale and distant, as if the sun itself hesitated to interfere with what was unfolding inside Ethan Walker's cabin. The fire burned steadily now, its warmth pushing back the worst of the cold, and Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor beside it, his attention fixed entirely on the small bundle wrapped in towels in front of him. The German Shepherd puppy was still frighteningly cold to the touch, its tiny body stiff, its breaths shallow and irregular, each rise of its chest so faint that Ethan found himself holding his own breath, counting, waiting, refusing to look away. Years earlier, in places far from Idaho, he had learned how fragile life could be, how quickly it slipped away if you hesitated or doubted yourself, and that training rose to the surface now with quiet authority. He warmed a bowl of milk on the stove, testing it carefully with his finger, the way he'd once tested IV lines and morphine doses, then drew the smallest amount into a dropper he'd found in an old first aid kit. The puppy's mouth barely opened when he touched the tip to its lips, but instinct did the rest, and the tiniest swallow followed. Then another, slow and weak, but real. "Easy," Ethan murmured, his voice low and steady, the tone of a man used to speaking to the wounded and terrified, a man who had once been responsible for keeping others alive long enough to see another sunrise. He fed the puppy a drop at a time, wiping excess milk from its chin, careful not to rush, knowing shock was as dangerous as the cold itself. Somewhere between those deliberate movements, he found himself giving the puppy a name. Not formally, not with ceremony, just quietly, as if saying it out loud made the fragile thing in front of him more real. "Buddy," he said once, testing it, the word carrying a warmth he hadn't expected to feel. The name stuck immediately. Hours passed unnoticed, measured only by the need to keep the fire fed and the puppy warm, and by the slow, incremental changes that told Ethan his efforts were not in vain. Buddy's breathing steadied, just slightly, enough to ease the tight knot in Ethan's chest, and his body began to soften as the ice melted away. Exhaustion tugged at Ethan, heavy and insistent, but he ignored it, the way he always did when something mattered more than rest. It was late in the afternoon when he heard a knock at the door, hesitant but firm, and for a split second, his body reacted before his mind, shoulders tensing, old instincts flaring. When he opened it, the cold rushed in again, along with Margaret Hill. She stood on the porch with her hands tucked into the pockets of a thick wool coat, her silver hair braided neatly down her back, her lined face pale from the cold but sharp-eyed as ever. Margaret was a small woman, narrow-shouldered and straight-backed despite her age, the kind of person who looked like she had been carved out of endurance rather than comfort, and her gray eyes missed very little. "Saw smoke," she said simply, her voice dry, carrying the faint rasp of years spent speaking more to herself than to others. "Thought you might need something." Ethan hesitated, unused to company, then stepped aside to let her in, the warmth of the cabin washing over her as she crossed the threshold. Her gaze fell immediately on the floor near the fire, on the towels, on the tiny shape within them, and something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful reserve she wore like armor. "Good Lord," she whispered, moving closer, her steps slow, reverent. "What happened?" Ethan explained in short sentences, economical and precise, the way he always did when emotions threatened to complicate things, and Margaret listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving the puppy. She knelt down beside him with surprising ease for someone her age, reaching out but stopping short of touching, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. "He's so small," she said, her voice softer now. "Just a baby." 2 weeks, Ethan replied. "Maybe less." Margaret nodded, swallowing, and Ethan noticed the way her hand trembled slightly before she curled it into a fist and tucked it back into her coat. She looked up at him then, really looked, and her gaze lingered on the faint white scars that crossed his forearms, the old burn mark near his wrist, the posture of a man who never quite relaxed even in safety. "You didn't sleep," she said, not a question. "Didn't seem important," Ethan answered. Something about that made Margaret turn away abruptly, lifting a hand to her face as if the fire had stung her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the crackle of the flames filling the space between them. When she finally looked back, her composure was mostly restored, but her eyes were bright. "My son used to sit like that," she said quietly, nodding toward Ethan. "All hunched over when something needed fixing. Didn't matter if it was a broken engine or a broken person." She paused, drawing a careful breath. "He was Army. Came home different. Tried to hide it. Didn't work." Ethan felt the weight of her words settle between them, familiar and heavy, and he nodded once, a gesture of understanding rather than sympathy. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out a small tin, setting it on the table without comment. "Goat's milk powder," she said. "Used to keep it for emergencies. Thought you might need more than whatever you had lying around." "Thank you," Ethan said, the words rough in his throat. She waved it off, already turning back toward the door. "I'll check in tomorrow," she added. "No sense pretending this doesn't matter." After she left, the cabin felt quieter, but not empty, and Ethan returned to his place by the fire, resuming his careful vigil. He mixed more milk, fed Buddy another few drops, and watched as the puppy's tiny paw twitched, its nose wrinkling as if reacting to a dream. Then, so suddenly Ethan almost missed it, Buddy's eyes opened, dark and unfocused, and a faint sound escaped him, not quite a whine, not quite a cry, but unmistakably alive. Ethan froze, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, until the sound came again, stronger this time, and something loosened in his chest that he hadn't realized was still clenched. Across the clearing outside, Margaret stood by her window, watching the faint glow from Ethan's cabin, and for the first time in years, tears slipped down her cheeks, unchecked, not from grief this time, but from the quiet, unexpected relief of seeing life choose to stay. The cold held its ground through the following day, the kind of winter cold that did not announce itself loudly but lingered, heavy and watchful, pressing against the cabin walls as if listening. Ethan Walker woke in the chair beside the hearth with his neck stiff and his joints aching, the fire reduced to glowing embers and the room filled with that dim gray light that came before full morning. For a moment, he didn't remember why he had slept there instead of his bed. And then he heard it, a soft, uneven sound, barely more than a breath. Buddy lay curled in the wooden crate Ethan had fashioned from scrapboards, his tiny body rising and falling with fragile determination. The worst of the ice gone now, replaced by a warmth that still felt uncertain, as though it could vanish if Ethan looked away for too long. He rose quietly, careful not to startle the puppy, and added wood to the fire, watching the flames catch before pulling on his coat and stepping outside. The snow was fresh, unbroken except for his own tracks and the faint marks left by something small and desperate on the porch the day before. Ethan scanned the tree line, his eyes trained by years of habit to notice absence as much as presence, and the lack of movement where instinct told him there should be something set his nerves on edge. A German shepherd mother would not leave her pup willingly, not in this cold, not without reason. He waited, standing still until the cold seeped through his boots, listening for any sound that did not belong to the wind. But the forest remained silent, the silence of a place where something had already happened. The realization settled slowly, unwelcome but unavoidable, that no mother was coming back. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, following faint tracks that led away from the cabin and disappeared beneath drifting snow, his jaw tightening as he went. He had seen this before in different forms, the aftermath rather than the moment itself, and he knew better than to cling to hope when evidence pointed elsewhere. When he returned inside, Margaret Hill was already there, standing near the table with a basket set down at her feet, her coat still on, her silver braid loosened slightly, as if she had dressed in a hurry. "I thought you'd be up early," she said, reading his expression before he spoke. Margaret's face looked drawn today, her skin pale against the dark wool, her posture stiff with a tension that suggested she had not slept well either. Ethan nodded once, glancing toward Buddy's crate. "I went looking," he said simply. "No sign of the mother." Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line, and she followed his gaze, her eyes softening when they landed on the puppy. "Then she's gone," she said quietly. "Or worse." She set the basket on the table and began unpacking it with practical efficiency. Jars of broth, folded cloths, a small bottle of antiseptic, the kind of supplies people like her kept not because they expected to need them, but because experience had taught them it was foolish to assume help would always arrive on time. "There have been traps," she added after a moment, her voice lowering. "Illegal ones. Steel jaws. I found one last week, not far from the creek." Ethan straightened, something old and sharp stirring in his chest. "You report it?" he asked. Margaret snorted softly. "To who? County office said they'd look into it. Same thing they always say." She glanced at him then, her gray eyes steady. "This land's been neglected long enough that men who don't care think they can do what they want." The words hit closer than she knew. Ethan had spent a career enforcing rules most people pretended not to see until it suited them, and the familiar anger rose unbidden, a controlled burn he had learned to manage but never fully extinguish. He looked down at Buddy again, the tiny creature sleeping on, unaware of how close he had come to vanishing entirely, and felt the decision forming even before he named it. Caring for the puppy had started as an emergency response, the kind of short-term mission he knew how to handle. But standing there, with the forest quiet and the truth heavy in the air, he understood that this was no longer something he could frame as temporary. "If she was caught," he said slowly, "then this isn't just bad luck." Margaret nodded. "No," she agreed. "It's someone's choice." She moved closer to the crate, crouching with a small grunt, studying Buddy's breathing. "He'll need more than warmth," she said. "Food every few hours, someone around. He won't survive being alone." The words were matter-of-fact, but the implication was anything but. Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest, heavier than the puppy itself had been when he carried him inside. Alone was a word he knew intimately, had chosen for himself, had worn like a shield against pain, and now here it was again, stripped of its protective meaning and laid bare as a danger instead. Margaret stood, brushing her hands on her coat. "I'll bring more supplies," she said, "and I'll keep making noise about those traps. Someone has to." Ethan met her gaze, seeing the resolve there, the quiet courage of a woman who had already buried too much to stay silent anymore. "I'll go out later," he said. "See what I can find." It wasn't a promise yet, not fully, but it was close. After Margaret left, the day passed in careful increments. Ethan fed Buddy on schedule, cleaned him gently, monitored his temperature, all the while watching the door and the windows as if expecting something to change, as if the forest might suddenly decide to return what it had taken. It did not. By evening, the absence had become its own presence, a confirmation rather than a question. Ethan sat on the floor beside the crate, his back against the rough-hewn wall, listening to the fire crackle and the wind rise outside, and allowed himself, finally, to name what he had been circling around all day. This puppy was his responsibility now, not because fate had dropped him on the porch, but because Ethan was choosing not to walk away. He watched Buddy sleep, his tiny paws twitching, his muzzle relaxing in a way that suggested a dream without fear, and felt something shift inside him, a quiet acceptance that carried both weight and relief. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if speaking the truth too loudly might break it. "This little life needs me," he said softly, the words settling into the room like a vow. After a pause, he added, almost reluctantly, "And maybe I need him too." The fire burned low, steady and warm, and for the first time since he had arrived in these mountains, Ethan did not feel the urge to move on. Winter did not loosen its hold on the mountains, but something inside Ethan Walker's cabin had begun to change, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the earliest hint of warmth beneath frozen ground. Days settled into a rhythm shaped around a small life that demanded consistency and presence, and Ethan found himself measuring time not by sunrise or sunset, but by feedings, by the steady strengthening of Buddy's breath, by the gradual certainty that the puppy was no longer merely surviving but beginning, slowly, to live. Buddy grew heavier in Ethan's hands with each passing day, his once brittle body softening, his coat darkening into the familiar black and tan pattern of his breed. His ears, still floppy and oversized for his head, giving him an awkward, endearing look that made Ethan catch himself smiling when he thought no one was watching. The puppy's eyes followed Ethan everywhere now, dark and curious, trusting in a way that unsettled him more than fear ever could, and Ethan found himself talking to Buddy as he worked, narrating small, ordinary tasks in a low voice that had not been used for conversation in years. He told Buddy about the weather, about the repairs he was making to the cabin roof, about nothing at all, really, and yet each word seemed to anchor him a little more firmly in the present. The cabin itself began to change alongside the puppy. Ethan patched gaps between the logs, replaced warped boards on the porch, and cleared snow with an attention to detail that went beyond necessity. These were not the repairs of a man passing through, but of someone investing in a place, and the realization caught him off guard when it surfaced. He laughed once, quietly, when Buddy barked for the first time, a thin, uncertain sound that surprised them both, and the laugh echoed strangely in the small space, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Margaret Hill noticed the changes, too. She began stopping by more frequently, sometimes with purpose, sometimes with an excuse thin enough to see through, her presence becoming a steady, expected part of Ethan's days. She brought bread one afternoon, the loaf wrapped in a clean cloth, still warm, the scent of yeast and butter filling the cabin in a way that tugged unexpectedly at Ethan's memory. Margaret was a careful baker, precise in her movements, her hands sure despite their age, and she moved through Ethan's kitchen as if it were an extension of her own, tidying small things without comment. She talked more now than she had before, her voice gaining warmth as familiarity replaced reserve, and she told Ethan about the greenhouse she had built years earlier, a narrow structure of salvaged windows and weathered wood that allowed her to grow greens even in the depths of winter. "You don't need much space," she explained, standing at the table with flour dusting her sleeves. "Just enough light and patience." Ethan listened, absorbing more than instructions. He helped her repair the greenhouse frame the following week, the two of them working side by side in companionable silence, the kind that did not demand explanation. Margaret was thinner up close than Ethan had realized, her shoulders narrow beneath her coat, her skin pale and creased by time and grief, but there was a resilience in the way she carried herself, a refusal to bend that reminded Ethan of the men he had trusted most in his old life. As they worked, she spoke of her son more openly, a young man with dark hair and an easy smile who had loved dogs and the mountains and had come home changed, quieter, carrying weight he never put down. Ethan did not interrupt, did not offer comfort where it was not asked for, and Margaret seemed to appreciate that, her words flowing more freely in the absence of pity. In return, Ethan found himself sharing fragments of his own past, not the details, not yet, but enough to acknowledge the loss that had shaped him, the choices that had led him here. Buddy grew between their conversations, his presence a constant, tangible reminder that life could still take root in unlikely places. He followed Ethan clumsily from room to room, tripping over his own paws, curling up near Margaret's boots when she visited, accepting her gentle touch with an earnest devotion that softened even her guarded expressions. The puppy became a bridge. Neither of them had intended to build, a shared focus that allowed grief to surface without overwhelming them, a reason to talk about the past without being trapped by it. Ethan noticed changes in himself that went beyond routine. He slept more deeply now, exhaustion earned rather than imposed, and when he woke, the familiar ache of loss no longer dominated his first thoughts. Instead, there was Buddy's soft breathing, the list of tasks waiting outside, the expectation of Margaret's knock. These were small things, but together they formed a shape Ethan recognized only dimly as something like belonging. One evening, as snow drifted steadily outside and the fire burned bright, Margaret sat at the table with a cup of tea, watching Ethan coax Buddy into chewing on a piece of worn leather instead of the chair leg. Her gaze lingered on the two of them, and when she spoke, her voice trembled in a way Ethan had not heard before. "Watching you with that puppy," she said quietly, her eyes glistening. "It's like watching my son come back." The words landed with unexpected force, and Ethan felt his throat tighten, emotion rising too quickly to deflect. He looked away, focusing on Buddy, on anything that would keep him steady, but the truth of her statement resonated deeply. He did not trust himself to respond, not with words, so he remained silent, his eyes burning, his jaw clenched as he absorbed the weight of what she had seen in him. Margaret did not press, did not apologize, simply reached across the table and rested her hand there, a brief, gentle gesture of connection that spoke volumes. Outside, the winter wind moved through the trees, indifferent and unchanging. But inside the cabin, amid the warmth and the quiet companionship, old wounds eased just enough to make room for something new. The woods changed their voice at night, and Ethan Walker noticed it long before he could explain how. The wind still moved through the pines, the snow still settled into the same drifts, but something beneath those familiar sounds had shifted, a low tension that raised the hair along his arms the way it once had before an ambush. Buddy felt it too. The young German shepherd, no longer the fragile bundle Ethan had carried in from the cold weeks earlier, but still small and unsteady on his growing legs, paced near the cabin door with restless energy, his ears twitching toward the dark beyond the windows. His coat had thickened into a healthy sheen, his body filling out with the awkward promise of size to come, and though his bark was still higher-pitched than it would someday be, there was already a note of warning in it that made Ethan pause. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, letting the cold air clear his head, his eyes adjusting automatically to the dark shapes of trees and shadowed ground. The snow reflected enough light to reveal disturbed patches near the edge of the clearing, tracks that did not belong to deer or fox, and Ethan's jaw tightened as he followed them cautiously, every sense sharpened by instinct. He found the first trap less than 50 yards from the cabin, half buried beneath snow and pine needles, its steel jaws open and waiting, crude and illegal and indiscriminate. The sight of it ignited something deep and volatile inside him, a surge of anger he had learned to harness rather than fear, and he knelt to disable it with practiced efficiency, careful to mark its location. He moved deeper into the woods, discovering more as he went, a deliberate line of traps placed close enough to threaten anyone or anything that wandered too far from the cabin. By the time he returned, his hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the effort of holding himself in check. He locked Buddy inside before heading out again the next evening, intent on mapping the area fully, and it was during that brief lapse of vigilance, a moment he would replay later with harsh clarity, that Buddy slipped past him, curiosity and loyalty pulling the puppy into the trees. The yelp that followed cut through Ethan like a blade. He spun, heart slamming, and sprinted toward the sound, dropping to his knees just in time to see Buddy's paw caught inches from a trap's teeth, the steel jaws snapping shut on empty snow where the puppy's foot had been moments before. Ethan scooped Buddy up, holding him tight, his breath coming fast as he checked the trembling little body for injury, relief flooding him so powerfully it left him dizzy. "Easy," he murmured, pressing his forehead briefly against Buddy's head, his voice breaking despite himself. The realization of how close he had come to losing this new, fragile bond hit him harder than any memory he could summon, and the anger that followed was cold and focused. This was no accident. Someone had placed these traps knowing full well what they could do. The next morning, Margaret Hill arrived earlier than usual, her coat pulled tight around her thin frame, her expression drawn and alert. She told Ethan of a man she'd seen near the creek the day before, tall and broad, with a heavy beard and a gait that suggested confidence born of intimidation rather than strength, someone she did not recognize and did not trust. "I told the county again," she said, her voice firm but strained. "They said they'd get back to me." Ethan saw the fear beneath her resolve, the same fear he had glimpsed when she spoke of her son, and it settled into his chest like a weight. That afternoon, a truck idled near the main road longer than necessary, its driver watching the cabin before moving on, and when Margaret found a note tacked to her fence, its message crude and unmistakable, the threat became personal. She showed it to Ethan without comment, her hands steady despite the words, but her eyes betrayed the memory it stirred, the echo of loss she had never fully laid to rest. Ethan made his decision then, the last of any hesitation falling away. He contacted federal wildlife authorities, detailing the traps, their locations, the threats. His voice calm and precise as he provided coordinates and descriptions, the same clarity he once used in reports that had carried far greater consequences. That night, he went back into the woods alone, disabling every trap he could find, marking the area, documenting evidence, moving with a purpose that felt painfully familiar. When he returned, Buddy waited by the door, his tail wagging uncertainly, and Ethan knelt to meet him, resting his hands on the young dog's shoulders, grounding himself in the warmth and solidity of the life he had nearly lost. Margaret stood nearby, watching him with a mix of gratitude and fear, and Ethan met her gaze squarely. "No one gets hurt on my watch," he said quietly, the vow emerging without thought, rooted in old promises and new resolve. "Not again." Outside, the woods remained dark and silent, but for the first time since the traps appeared, the silence felt like something he could face head-on, rather than something to endure. Spring tried to arrive quietly in the mountains, tentative and unsure, as if the land itself was waiting for permission to believe the worst was over. The snow still clung to the shaded edges of the forest, but patches of dark earth had begun to show through, and the air carried a different scent now, sharper, cleaner, touched with the promise of thaw. Ethan Walker noticed these changes the way he noticed most things, without comment but with attention, his senses tuned to shifts that meant safety or threat. Since the federal officers had come through weeks earlier and removed the last of the illegal traps, the woods had settled into a calmer rhythm, one that no longer set his nerves humming at night. The silence remained, but it was no longer hostile. Buddy seemed to sense it too. The young German shepherd had grown quickly, his body lengthening, his legs gaining strength and coordination, his ears beginning to stand upright in uneven stages that gave him a perpetually curious expression. His coat was thick and glossy now, his movements confident, and he rarely strayed far from Ethan's side, following him from cabin to woodpile to clearing with an alert devotion that bordered on reverence. Where once he had been a fragile life Ethan feared to lose, Buddy had become a steady presence, a constant reminder that care given freely could take root and endure. Ethan spoke to him less out of necessity now and more out of habit, sharing thoughts he might once have swallowed, finding that the simple act of saying things aloud no longer felt foreign. The cabin reflected that shift. The repairs Ethan had begun in winter were complete, the porch reinforced, the roof sealed, the interior scrubbed clean and rearranged to accommodate not just one man passing through, but a life intended to stay. Margaret Hill noticed the transformation immediately. She came by one afternoon with a basket of seedlings balanced carefully against her hip, her thin frame wrapped in a faded blue coat, her silver hair escaping its braid in wisps that caught the light. She looked older in the spring sun, the fine lines on her face more visible without winter's harsh contrast. But there was something lighter in her expression, an ease that had not been there before. "Thought you might be ready for these," she said, setting the basket on the table. "Lettuce, spinach, a few herbs, nothing fancy." Ethan accepted them with a nod, grateful in a way he did not bother to mask. They worked together in the small greenhouse behind the cabin, the one Margaret had helped him repair, their hands busy with soil and fragile stems, Buddy sprawled nearby, content to watch. Margaret talked as she worked, about practical things at first, about watering schedules and frost warnings, then gradually about herself, about the quiet afternoons that no longer stretched endlessly now that she had reasons to leave her house, about the way grief felt different when it was shared rather than endured alone. Ethan listened, offering responses when they were needed, finding that the weight he carried shifted slightly when it was acknowledged by someone who understood loss without needing it, explained. Over time, Margaret's visits grew more frequent, her presence less formal. She brought pie one evening, insisting it was too much for her alone, and stayed to eat with Ethan. The three of them gathered around the table, Buddy's head resting against Ethan's knee, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever Margaret laughed. It was during one of those evenings that she said it, almost casually, as if testing the words before committing to them. "My boys," she called out from the kitchen when Ethan and Buddy disappeared briefly outside. The phrase lingered in the air when they returned, and Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. He did not correct her. Instead, he found himself smiling, the expression coming easily now, no longer feeling like an intrusion into a life he did not deserve. The sense of family that formed between them was unspoken but unmistakable, built not on obligation but on choice, on the quiet understanding that they were better together than apart. That understanding was tested when a letter arrived addressed to Ethan, its crisp white envelope standing out starkly against the worn wood of the table. It was an offer from a private security firm, the kind that recruited men like him, men with specialized training and a tolerance for risk, promising a generous salary and a return to a world where his skills were valued and his past was an asset rather than a burden. Ethan read it once, then again, feeling the familiar pull of purpose it represented, the clear lines and defined roles that had once given his life structure. For a brief moment, the idea tempted him, the thought of movement and distance offering a way to avoid the deeper commitments he had been forming here. Margaret noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Bad news?" she asked gently, setting a kettle on the stove. Ethan handed her the letter without comment, watching her eyes scan the page. She did not react the way he expected. There was no fear, no disappointment, only a quiet acceptance. "You have to choose what's right for you," she said after a moment, meeting his gaze. "I won't hold you here." The words were kind, but they carried an echo of past departures that made Ethan's resolve crystallize. He looked down at Buddy, who had pressed closer, sensing tension, his warm weight grounding Ethan in the present. In that moment, the choice became clear, not as a rejection of who he had been, but as an affirmation of who he was becoming. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "I'm staying," he said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "This is home." Margaret smiled then, a soft, proud expression that mirrored something like relief, and reached out to squeeze his hand briefly. Outside, the forest stood quiet and open, no longer a place of threat, but of possibility. That night, as Ethan watched Buddy curl up by the hearth, his breathing slow and content, he felt the weight of his decision settle comfortably into place. He had chosen family, not by blood, but by care and commitment, and for the first time since his old life had ended, the future no longer felt like something he needed to outrun. Winter returned the following year with a quieter confidence, settling over the northern Idaho mountains like a familiar guest who knew where everything belonged. Snow fell steadily but without cruelty, blanketing the forest and the clearing around Ethan Walker's cabin in a clean, forgiving white. The air was sharp and clear, the kind that made every breath feel deliberate, and the sky hung low and pale, diffusing the daylight into something soft and reflective. Buddy sat on the front steps, his broad chest rising slowly, his thick German shepherd coat dusted with snowflakes that melted and vanished into his fur. He was fully grown now, powerful and steady, his amber-brown eyes alert but calm, ears erect and confident. No trace left of the fragile puppy who had once lain frozen on these same boards. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, watching him for a moment longer than necessary, the memory of that first winter morning never far from his thoughts. He had mounted a small wooden sign beside the door earlier that day, its lettering simple and hand-carved, the grain of the wood still visible beneath the varnish. Walker and Buddy. Home. It was not meant for visitors so much as for himself, a quiet declaration that the wandering had ended. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden light across the walls Ethan had reinforced, and the shelves Margaret Hill had helped him fill over the past year. Margaret now lived just down the road in a smaller cabin closer to Ethan's, a move she'd made without ceremony, but with clear intent. She was seated in her favorite chair by the fire, her posture relaxed, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun that left her face open and expressive. Age had thinned her frame and softened her features, but there was a strength in her eyes that came from survival rather than force, and a kindness that no longer felt guarded. She smiled when Ethan entered the room, the expression easy and unforced. "He looks proud out there," she said, nodding toward Buddy. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded. He earned it. Their days had settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Mornings began with shared coffee, afternoons with small projects, evenings with quiet conversation, and the comforting presence of Buddy stretched between them like a living bridge. Margaret's laughter came more easily now, and Ethan found that his own silences no longer felt empty. They spoke of the past when it surfaced naturally, not as an obligation but as acknowledgement, and they planned for the future in modest ways, planting gardens, storing supplies, preparing for winters, not with fear, but with confidence. Buddy moved between them with an instinctive awareness, resting his head on Margaret's knee when she grew tired, shadowing Ethan on his walks through the woods, his loyalty unwavering but never possessive. On that winter evening, as darkness settled early and the wind brushed softly against the cabin walls, Ethan stepped outside to call Buddy in. The dog rose immediately, shook the snow from his coat, and trotted toward the door, pausing briefly at the top step to look back at the forest. There was no tension in his stance, no alertness born of danger, only a calm watchfulness, as if he were acknowledging the land that had tested them both and found them worthy of remaining. Inside, the door closed behind them, sealing out the cold. Ethan crouched beside Buddy, running a hand along the dog's strong neck, feeling the solid warmth beneath his fingers. Margaret watched them with a soft expression, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I'd feel this settled again." Ethan understood. He felt it too, the sense of having arrived not at a destination but at a way of living that no longer required escape. He had not erased his past, nor had he been absolved of it, but he had learned how to carry it without being crushed. Buddy lifted his head and leaned into Ethan's touch, a simple gesture that held more meaning than words. The three of them sat together as the fire burned low, the cabin filled with a peace that was not the absence of hardship, but the presence of connection. Outside, winter held the mountains in its quiet grip, but inside there was light, steady and enduring. Ethan looked around the room, at Margaret's contented smile, at Buddy's calm vigilance, at the sign visible through the window, and felt a gratitude that bordered on reverence. He thought of all the choices that could have led him elsewhere, all the moments when he might have turned away, and understood at last that staying had been the bravest act of his life. Sometimes God doesn't send answers. He sends lives that need saving, and in saving them, we save ourselves. At the end of this story, we're reminded that miracles don't always arrive as sudden answers or dramatic signs from the sky. Sometimes God sends something small, quiet, and fragile into our path. A life that needs care, patience, and courage. In choosing to stop, to help, to stay, we often discover that the blessing was never only meant for the one we saved, but for our own hearts as well. In everyday life, we pass moments like this more often than we realize. opportunities to be kind, to protect, to love when it would be easier to turn away. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, compassion, and second chances. May God bless you, watch over your home, and fill your days with quiet miracles and steady light.